Was just so intense. It was an intensity that I'd never felt before from any psychedelic. I felt like I was kind of like clinging on to like the edge of a cliff. If you're taking a sacred medicine that comes from an ancestral lineage, take it really seriously. You know, this is something that they've had to work, you know, a lot at safekeeping and guarding. It's really our job to make sure that when we go into these spaces, you know, whether it's with an Indigenous healer or whether it's somebody who has learned from an Indigenous tradition, but perhaps it's not from the community, making sure that we're really actually learning about the tradition and the culture and where it comes from.
So today we have on the show Magdalena, who also likes to be called Mags, which is what I'll be calling her, Tanev, and she is from near Manchester in the UK, but she currently lives in Colombia. And one of the reasons to do with that is she is a psychedelic journalist. So obviously in Latin America and Colombia, there's a lot of ayahuasca ceremonies that she's going to be talking about today. She facilitates the monthly online integration circle for Colibri Garden. And we're actually going to be talking about that process of integration, which is essentially, if you're doing something like ayahuasca or psychedelics, how can you use it positively, integrate it into your life? And that's not just with psychedelics, it's any kind of spiritual experience or expansion of consciousness. How can you then integrate that into your daily life? I got some tactics which I wish I knew about before taking ayahuasca. So anyone that's thinking about taking ayahuasca, has ceremonies coming up, I think this is going to be a really useful podcast for you. Right, so Mags, we were introduced by Tom Jenkins, who I know is another guest on the show, is also involved in the world of like ayahuasca, psychedelics, like you are in Colombia. What I find is everyone's journey with psychedelics, I can only talk about ayahuasca, which I think is the only psychedelic I've taken, but everyone has a very unique journey. So to kick off, I was wondering if you could tell us like what led you to psychedelics, how come you started taking them?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mikey. And thank you for having me on the show. So my journey with psychedelics was kind of typical in that my first interaction with psychedelics was when I was at uni. I think I was like 20 years old. And we were taking psilocybin truffles with some friends at uni. And I don't think any of us had any idea around taking psychedelics with an intention, around set and setting, around any of that. So it was just like a purely recreational experience. And then it was a good few years after that journey with psilocybin truffles, where I actually kind of started to take them a little bit more intentionally and get more curious. So I've been living in Colombia for 5 years, and it was kind of like my first couple of years after arriving to Colombia. I had a lot of friends who were getting involved in ayahuasca. I had some friends who were experimenting with DMT and psilocybin mushrooms. So I had tried DMT once with a friend, and then done LSD a couple of times. But I think really sort of like the breakthrough psychedelic medicine for me was ayahuasca. And I think like a common thread, even from having been at uni and then with these first few experiences with psychedelics and eventually ayahuasca here in Colombia, I think a common thread was curiosity more than healing. And I know a lot of people come to medicines, especially ayahuasca, which is not a recreational experience, with very specific healing goals in mind. For me, initially, it was really about curiosity and just feeling this very strong pull and call to try these medicines. You know, I've kind of always been interested in exploring different modes of consciousness, and I knew there was something there to explore personally with regards to my own spirituality. I felt like I wasn't really very in touch with my spiritual side. I think I thought I didn't have a spiritual side. I kind of like brushed that sort of stuff off. But kind of the more I got involved in it, the more I realized that there's a lot more to explore there. So that was kind of the reasoning for my first few experiences with ayahuasca. And then after kind of experimenting and going to ceremonies and getting more in touch with the tradition and understanding the medicine more, then I feel like the medicine opened up a whole other world to me, which was the world of healing and self-discovery and really getting to understand myself better and getting to grow as a person.
You said one of your aims and intentions was kind of to be more spiritual before you took ayahuasca. Would you say you were more of like atheist, nihilist? Like, I guess, how did it change your views on spirituality?
Yeah, I would have definitely called myself an atheist. I mean, it's I used to, for example, listen to a lot of like Sam Harris podcasts. I was very, very put off by the idea of religion. I didn't grow up religious, but I think I definitely kind of like in uni, in the few years after uni, I definitely started to pay a lot more attention to different atheist thinkers and a lot of, like I said, Sam Harris, a lot of critique of religion. And I think just the whole idea of organized religion was very, very off-putting for me. So I think I kind of put spirituality in sort of like the same sort of realm as religion, and didn't really understand how the two could be very separate. So yeah, I would say I definitely wasn't a very spiritual person before, and that's kind of the camp that I would have put myself in.
Go into the journey with ayahuasca, because obviously I want to come on to your experience of things like integration. Obviously, you're a psychedelics journalist now, so I do want to get into that. But just before we do, be interesting to hear around firstly, like just quickly explain what ayahuasca is, because I think a lot of people listening won't know. They may not have listened to Tom's podcast. And then after that, like talk us through, I guess, your first ceremonies and then some of the ceremonies you've done since then. Like, how did you feel? What was the experience? And like, how has the experience changed over time with the more ceremonies that you've done?
So ayahuasca is a sacred medicine that comes from the Amazon rainforest. It's used by indigenous communities in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, and in Brazil. And it's essentially the combination of a vine and a leaf. And the leaf is what contains the DMT, which provides for a lot of people a visionary experience. And then the vine provides a purgative experience, and it's contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which is what allows us to feel the effects of the DMT in the body and in the mind.
When you
So
said,
when these,
sorry, just interrupting that, because it's actually, even though I've taken ayahuasca, I didn't, you said something there that I didn't know, the purgative. So is that like, because I know going into, and you may get into this now with your own story, but when you take ayahuasca, two things that can happen is you purge, and when you purge, it's either like vomiting or like doing a number two, not to get too
yeah,
graphic. And is it that bit, the vine you said, that is like making that happen?
yeah, it is. And yeah, like you said, ayahuasca can produce these purgative effects, but they often happen, you know, in terms of vomiting and maybe going to the loo, like you mentioned, but there are a number of other different ways that ayahuasca helps us purge. And it's not just a physical purge. I mean, the physical purge in terms of like cleansing the physical body is a really important element of it. And there are a lot of people who have found physical healing through ayahuasca, but through that purging, it's also an emotional and a spiritual cleanse as well. So a lot of people will find that they'll be physically purging, you know, they might be vomiting or shaking, trembling, laughing, crying, yawning, talking, like all of these different sort of somatic functions or ways of purging. And they'll find that they can feel certain emotions or certain blockages, certain traumas being released through that purge. So essentially, like when I've asked this question to Indigenous Taitas here in Colombia, they've told me that yagé or ayahuasca is a physical, a spiritual, and an emotional cleanse. So it's a way to cleanse the body, and it's a really, really powerful medicine in terms of healing. It's a really powerful medicine in terms of self-discovery. It's a medicine that you really can't lie to. You know, it's going to show you your truth. And what people often say is that the medicine will give you what you need, not necessarily what you want. So yeah, that's kind of in essence what ayahuasca is.
It's interesting what you said around like the laughing can be like a form of purging as well. Because I remember when I did it, there was a girl who I did it with, and I think she had, like you said, everyone has different reasons, and I think she'd had a lot of trauma, so there was a lot of healing she needed to do, and the sounds that were coming out of her were a lot more extreme than anyone else. I remember she was laughing an insane amount. She had this really
like almost contagious laugh that was massive, but then she also like became different animals like cats and lions and things. But from the sounds of what you're saying, that was like a form of purging for her.
Yeah. And I think something that's important to remember with ayahuasca and most psychedelics is everything that you might feel is normal. Everything that you might experience isn't, like, oftentimes when people are new, they'll say like, oh, is this normal? You know, they'll start feeling weird, they'll do something weird, and they'll think like, oh, maybe this isn't supposed to happen. But there's literally no script as to what's going to happen when you drink ayahuasca. Everyone's experience is unique, and every experience itself is different from the next one and the previous one. So you'll never have two ceremonies that are the same.
Yeah, so talking about that, can you run us through like how was your first ceremony and then how are the ones after? Because from what you're saying, it sounds like they're all quite different.
Yeah, so my first ceremony with ayahuasca, I was really, really nervous beforehand. And I think the medicine knew how nervous I was. And I think she knew that she had to ease me in gently. And that's kind of what it felt like. I went to a ceremony up in Santa Elena, which is around an hour outside of Medellin, which is where I now live. And yeah, like I said, I was really, really nervous beforehand. I was with some friends, you know, who had been to this place before, and I felt like I was very much in safe hands. But I didn't feel in any way confident about my ability to truly surrender and let go going into the experience. So what I found was it was very, I feel like it kind of took me to the limits of what I was ready for in that moment, which kind of demonstrates just the intelligence of the plant and how she really knows how to work with everybody on the level that they're ready with, as long as you're with a shaman or a facilitator that is able to, you know, work with you and dose you in the correct way. So I definitely had some visions. I saw a lot of fractals. I had lots of emotions coming up. I felt like did have like a lot of insights come through and a lot of realizations. But I really had this kind of deep understanding that she was really just kind of allowing me to dip my toe in. And it was really just like the tip of what was going to be possible for me with this medicine. And after that experience, I knew that I wanted to go back. So I think it was maybe like 6 weeks until I went for another ceremony. And it was kind of like a similar thing again, sort of like getting a feel for the medicine, getting a feel for how she works. And then in the following few months, I went back another couple of times. And then the pandemic hit. So I didn't actually have another ceremony for maybe like 8 or 9 months or something like that. And then the ceremony that I did after that, it was meaningful, but not kind of one of those breakthrough experiences that you hear about. And then the ceremony after that, which was kind of a year and a half after my first ceremony, I went to a new taita that I hadn't drunk medicine with before. And this taita is the name for the ayahuasca curandero or shaman in Colombia. And this taita is kind of renowned for having really, really strong medicine. And that experience was really the one that was sort of like the key in the door, and just kind of like, I think that was the first experience where I felt like there was a before and an after, and there was like concrete changes that were made in my life after that experience. So up until that point, I'd been working at a PR company. I'm a writer, so I was working as a ghostwriter for a PR company and editing and managing people as well. And I think at that point, it was getting to the point where I was really struggling to see what I was gaining from the job, as opposed to, you know, what I was, you know, contrasting with what I was putting into it energetically. And this ceremony just really showed me really, really like physically and visually all of the places where I was like harboring all of this stress inside my body and how it was causing all of this tension. And she really sort of like showed me all of that and kind of presented me with this option, like either you stay in this job, you know, dreaming about your clients and waking up and checking your email as soon as your alarm goes off, or like you have faith that there's more out there for you and you kind of take a step back and explore other options. So I think it was maybe like a month after that ceremony that I quit that job and I started to gravitate a lot more heavily towards pursuing psychedelic journalism and exploring, more about these medicines and how I might be able to turn that into a professional path for myself.
Oh, so it sounds like it was like the fifth or sixth ceremony. You'd had quite a few ceremonies at that point.
Yeah, exactly. It was like the fifth or the sixth.
Interesting. Yeah, because I also think, and we'll get into the integration part later, but I think a lot of people go into ayahuasca and they want a quick fix. They're like, oh, I'm going to do this 1 or 2 nights and all my problems are going to be solved. But as you said, you have to put a lot of effort into it. And on the subject of effort, in my experiences, what I found is sometimes the darker the place you go to, sometimes the more the growth is going to be. And obviously, if we take this outside of the context of ayahuasca, sometimes struggles in our life will lead to the most growth. That like fifth or sixth ceremony, and I've talked to Tom about this as well, is like, did you go to some kind of dark places, but then you came out the other side and that was why there was a lot of growth? Or why was it that particular ceremony that really helped you?
Yeah, I mean, it was just so intense. It was an intensity that I'd never felt before, from any psychedelic. I felt like I was kind of like clinging on to like the edge of a cliff, and I just had to recruit all of my spiritual resources and all of the, minutes that I'd spent meditating and preparing and everything that I'd done up until that point in my life. I felt like I had to recruit all of it to just like really try and stay in my center and stay grounded and not resist the experience to the point that I knew it would send me even deeper into a more intense place. So I wouldn't necessarily describe it as dark, but I would just describe it as really, really intense. But I think this is the intelligence of the plant, that she knew that I was ready for that experience at that moment. And that was exactly the experience that I was supposed to have at that time. So it was, very, very intense visuals to the point where it just felt like so overwhelming that you can't handle it anymore. But, like with all psychedelics, what you resist persists. So the more that you resist and the more that you try and stop the experience from continuing or getting even more intense, the more it's gonna get more intense. So really just trying to stay in my center, stay with my breath, stay in gratitude. I have different mantras that I stay over and over to myself in my head as I'm in these intense moments and in these difficult moments. And like you said, what often happens when we have an experience that really challenges us is that afterwards the insights are even greater, and the information, almost like the rewards that we receive for having like gone through that, are just so rich and so, so meaningful. So I really felt like that was kind of a big challenge in a way, sort of like an initiation into like going deeper with the medicine after that experience, especially, when, like you said, with integration, it's so important, especially when you do your homework and you go back to the medicine, you begin to get even more and more insights and even more information.
Yeah, so let's talk about integration. I think you obviously mentioned quite a nice story in your own life, which is that you went from kind of this job that you weren't necessarily that happy in, you were very stressful, to now doing this. You're a journalist around writing around psychedelics, which you're clearly passionate about. So you were able to integrate your experience in a way there was a positive change, the words you use, like before and after. So one, how did you go about that? And two, like, how are you, because I imagine you're still taking ayahuasca, so like, how are you like integrating your experiences after these ceremonies?
Yeah, so like you said, just to give like a little bit of a definition of integration, if people aren't super familiar with the term, it's essentially this practice of integrating all of the information and the insights that we receive during a medicine experience. And it doesn't necessarily have to be with a psychedelic, it could be a meditation retreat, it could be a breathwork experience, anything where you feel like you receive information that you want to turn into concrete changes in your life. Obviously, that's going to take work after the experience. These medicines and these experiences are not a magic pill. They're not going to do the work for us. As the Taita that we work with here in Colombia likes to say, the medicine will give you 50% and you have to put in the other 50%. I often think that it's, you have to put in even more than 50% to be able to create these changes in your life. So for me personally, integration has looked like I think community has been a really, really important part of my integration. Having other people to talk to, having support around my goals, and having guidance around my goals, and having accountability. I think that's been a really, really crucial, detail for me. At one point I was also doing integration coaching with somebody who was very skilled in helping me on that path. And then, I think it's kind of a bit of a cliche, but, getting in those daily practices that really help you remember everything that you're trying to do, why you're doing what you're doing. I'm not the most consistent person with meditation, but I think meditation is a really, really great tool to just be able to like come back into yourself, and along with other practices that really involve, being in the body rather than staying in the mind, journaling, and then just building like little rituals and, building the sacred into your everyday life as well, I think has always been something that's been really helpful for me to just remember. Even just having like an altar at home where I have like different things that remind me of ceremonies, or like a piece of ayahuasca vine, and, like different tools. That's been really helpful for me to just like always, allow me to remember why I'm doing what I'm doing, and what my goals are. And then there are other medicines as well so go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just going to say, do you like to say you just had the experience? Do you like write stuff down of like things that have come up, so they stay with you and you can bring those back to Santa Elena where you're living?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great one, actually. We usually when I am talking to people who might be new to the experience, or like going into an ayahuasca ceremony, it's really, really helpful even to take a journal or a notebook with you to the experience, and as soon as you can, like write down what you experienced and what you learned, and then continuing to journal in the days after. I think that's really helpful. And then just like a daily journal practice can really help you remember. And then a few months will go by, and then going back through those notes that you made when you were fresh out of the ceremony definitely can help you remember everything that you are kind of wanting to take away from the experience.
And I imagine integration is not, we're talking about after the event, which is obviously hugely important, but I imagine that process starts before the event. And I was reading one of your articles before, and you were talking about intentions. So what are some of the things that you need to do before taking ayahuasca that are going to make your ceremony successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think, the moment that you commit to a retreat or commit to a ceremony, that's when your experience starts. That in a way, that's when the ceremony starts, and that's when your, post-ceremony integration starts, because everything that you do to prepare and to set your intention for the experience. As a friend of mine, Ivailo, he's a sacred medicine facilitator and an integration coach, as he likes to put it, it builds energetic momentum that you then carry into the experience. And a really key part of that is setting your intention. And the intention is so crucial because it's your why. So if you get into difficult terrain in the ceremony, if you get into a space where you feel like you're being really, really challenged to stay in your center and to stay grounded, remembering your intention, remembering why you're doing what you're doing is going to be a really, really helpful anchor in keeping you in that space. And keeping you in gratitude and keeping you grounded when things might get a little bit more challenging. And your intention doesn't have to be something very, very specific to your personal healing journey. Oftentimes it is, but it can also be something like a little bit broader. Maybe like my intentions when I first went into the ceremony was show me what I need to see. Like show me like different realms, different areas of consciousness that are available to us. It might even be, learning more about the medicines themselves. That's an intention that I've had kind of later in my journey with ayahuasca, is I want to learn more about the medicine. Like I want to learn more about how it, how she works, how to build a deeper relationship with the spirit of the plant. So your intention can really be whatever you feel called to in the moment. There's no right or wrong answer, but it is going to be a really crucial part of that journey.
So do you think a lot of people take ayahuasca for the wrong reasons and with the wrong intentions? That maybe, hey, I just want to trip out, right? And they see it as, you mentioned the word earlier, like recreational drug. versus a medicine, and you've repeated multiple times in this podcast, like, you know, the word medicine, which I think it is. But I know to some people they may look at a psychedelic on paper or ayahuasca as, oh, this is just some like hippie drug. It's not a medicine, right? So what do you? Because I'm sure you've had people in your life who've said that. Like, what do you say when someone says that to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that you kind of really have to experience to truly understand what it is. But for people who maybe still have this stigma attached to it, I would just, point them in the direction of learning about the fact that this is a traditional medicine. This comes from generations and generations and generations of an ancestral lineage. And it's been used by these indigenous communities in the Amazon for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So they know what they're doing. This isn't something new. This isn't something that's just been invented in the last 20 years that, Westerners and foreigners have started to get involved in it. So if there's any sort of doubt about its efficacy as a medicine, I would just encourage them to learn more about the traditional uses and how beneficial and how important this medicine has been to those communities, and how it's in many of these communities, it's actually a pillar of well-being and health. And in addition to that, there are so many stories of healing that you can find. So many stories, not just my own personal story of how I benefited, but there have been, countless books written about people's healing journeys with ayahuasca and things that, seemingly would have been impossible to, or people would have thought would have been impossible to heal and impossible to cure. And, this medicine has allowed them to overcome different challenges. So I think that's probably where I would start.
What are some of those? You mentioned a couple of stories there. What are some like mad things you've heard about with people that have taken ayahuasca?
So there's a really good book by Dr. Joseph Tafur, who was a Western trained medical doctor, but also trained in Amazonian shamanism. And in his book, The Fellowship of the River, which I would really recommend anyone who's interested in healing with ayahuasca to read, he talks about stories of people who've had, chronic migraines their entire life, chronic anxiety their entire life, chronic gastrointestinal problems, even people who've had cancer and, terminal diagnoses have found, not just with ayahuasca, but with many, many different sacred medicines, Kambo, as well as a really powerful one. And they found that a lot of times the manifestation of trauma that they had not released and processed and healed from was these physical diseases. And as soon as they were able to process and release this trauma that they were suffering with their entire lives, their symptoms, were dramatically improved. So yeah, there are a lot of stories.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's like the trauma, which you could call a psychological thing, also has the physical impacts, like you said as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that I'm really, really learning more about recently in my in my work, and the people that I've been interviewing and the things that I've been exploring recently is this separation between the mind and the body is non-existent. And it's a very, very Western construct that we think that everything that we suffer from emotionally, psychologically just stays up in the mind, and it's a problem of the mind, but it's not true. The trauma lives in the body, and in order to fully heal it, we have to make sure that there's a lot of embodiment work and a lot of somatic processes involved in that as well.
Yeah, 100%. So one of the terminologies you use, which I really like, which makes sense, is, as you're a journalist and a great writer, but you said we're in this like psychedelic renaissance at the moment. And I actually think I obviously gave you the kind of objection earlier around people would say, oh, it's a psychedelic, it's a drug, etc. But I actually think there's kind of less and less people like that. I do think psychedelics and psychedelic therapy is actually becoming quite mainstream at the moment. And obviously we've had certain legalizations in certain countries. But the reason I'm bringing this up is, I can't remember who said this, but I was listening to quite an interesting podcast recently, and they were talking about how we've actually already had a psychedelic renaissance, like in the 70s, right? When a lot of people started taking LSD. And actually at the start with that, it was meant to be therapeutic. And there was actually a lot of psychiatrists and therapists that were doing like LSD therapy with their clients. I know Stanislav Grof was one of them, as an example. But then LSD kind of like made its way onto like the festival scene, which was obviously exploding in that time in the US and kind of across the world. So it was almost like psychedelics eventually got used in an irresponsible way. And obviously that's why then, governments started making them illegal, etc. So now we're in this, maybe, I wouldn't call it a second psychedelic renaissance, because as you said, they're very ancient, things like ayahuasca. In terms of, in the last 100 years, we're in this like second wave. It's important that we use them in a responsible way, and also we respect the medicine. Like you said, it's a medicine and it's not like a recreational drug. And I know one of the things you're very passionate about is respecting like Indigenous traditions and Indigenous voices. And I think these two things are interrelated, because obviously they really understand the medicine, right? Them and their ancestors, as you said, they've been using it for tens of thousands of years. I was wondering if you could talk to us about that, and kind of like, what are your opinions on when it comes to like the Indigenous voice with these, say, ayahuasca as an example, and like how we can protect that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for laying that out. I think this is just such a crucial point, because I think we're at such a this is such an important time in terms of how psychedelics are now going to evolve and become more of a part of mainstream culture, as all of these decriminalization and legalization laws are coming to effect, primarily in the US, but I believe other countries are going to follow suit as well. But the US is definitely, in terms of like the Western psychedelic renaissance, it's definitely leading at this moment. And, as a result of this, a lot of people are kind of like seeing that there's going to be a lot of money to be made from these medicines, kind of as there was with cannabis legalization.
Yeah.
There are going to be a lot of opportunities. There's going to be a lot of demand. There already is a lot of demand of people who desperately need healing. It's no secret that we're in a mental health epidemic at the moment. There are a lot of people who stand to benefit from these medicines, and there are a lot of people who are kind of wanting to fill their pockets as a result of this demand as well. So, when I see, for example, something like an ayahuasca pill being created, and, this company that's created this ayahuasca pill is using that name, ayahuasca. And the reality is that this pill has nothing to do with ayahuasca whatsoever. It might contain DMT and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, but that's, it's completely synthetic. Doesn't carry the spirit of ayahuasca. It doesn't come from plants, and it's using the name of this sacred medicine basically as a marketing tool so that they can sell this pill. And maybe you get the benefits of ayahuasca. I put that in air quotes, without the actual purging. Which is just, in my eyes, I think it's just ridiculous. So I think more and more we're going to see different players and different companies that have financial interests. There's also a lot of patenting going on as well. And as all of this starts to erupt, and has already erupted, and all of this continues to develop, a lot of these companies are kind of leaving behind or pushing aside this responsibility that we have to the Indigenous communities from which these traditions come, and from whom we have learned a lot about how to work with the medicines, how to facilitate, even if it's not even necessarily an Indigenous medicine that somebody's working with. These traditions carry a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge that can be spread and permeated through different uses of different medicines. So I think, a lot of people at the moment are talking about Indigenous reciprocity, which is basically ensuring that the relationship that we have with Indigenous communities and the medicines that they carry is reciprocal. It's not just this kind of, colonial practice of taking the medicine, extracting the benefits that we want from it, but then not giving back to the communities themselves that are responsible not only for carrying the tradition of the medicine, but also looking after the territories from which it comes, and where it's grown and where it all originates. So yeah, I would just say, like any psychedelic business really has this responsibility to practice Indigenous reciprocity, to ensure that they're giving back to Indigenous communities in a meaningful way, not in kind of like the typical white savior way of just like chucking money at a community and or telling them how they need to use it, but like with deep engagement with these communities around what their needs are, what they really, really are wanting to prioritize at the moment. And I think environmental protection is a really, really crucial part of that. And then just kind of on an individual level, if you're, taking ayahuasca, if you're taking a sacred medicine that comes from an ancestral lineage, take it really seriously. This is something that they've had to work, a lot at safekeeping and guarding. These communities have faced, an immeasurable amount of violence, of resource extraction, of colonialism, and they've still kept these traditions alive, and now they're actually sharing them with people from outside of their communities. And it's really our job to make sure that when we go into these spaces, whether it's with an Indigenous healer or whether it's somebody who has learned from an Indigenous tradition but perhaps it's not from the community, making sure that we're really actually learning about the tradition and the culture and where it comes from itself. I think a lot of people kind of hear ayahuasca and they think like, oh yeah, it's it's this people maybe wanting to use it for, but like biohacking or something like that, or just sort of seeing it as this like not a reciprocal relationship between you and the medicine, but a way in which we can respect the tradition in these communities is really making an effort to actually learn about where it comes from, how the medicine has been guarded through all of these years, and thinking about how you might be able to give back to these communities on an individual level as well. And part of that is making sure that whoever you drink medicine with is doing it in integrity, has done the proper training, and has the blessing of an elder who comes from one of these ancestral lineages or has studied with one of these ancestral lineages.
Yeah, and the thing you mentioned about the pill, it kind of made me think, there's that quote, right? Fall in love with the journey, not the destination. And obviously in Indigenous communities, they know that process, right? And that journey. And it almost seems like some people are coming in from the outside and saying, how can we have shortcuts, right? And that's almost the point of ayahuasca, is there's no shortcuts. You got to go through the process to like have those learnings. And again, that goes into the integration, what you're talking about. You're not going to have any type of integration if you don't go through that journey yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a classic thing, isn't it, to just want to take a pill to solve all your problems? That's very much like a Western mentality towards healing. But exactly, I would agree with what you said. It's not a side effect that ayahuasca makes you feel. It's the point. So when I hear people talking about like, oh, it's a side effect, I'm like, no, that's what you want. You want that to happen.
Yeah, 100%. You mentioned something interesting there. I may have been reading between the lines something that didn't exist, but you said around like, they're starting to share it with the wider world, right? So was there a period, I guess, during like colonialism or anything like that, where ayahuasca was a bit of a secret for like the Indigenous community that they didn't want to like give to the outside world?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it was, as far as I know, it was this ethnobotanist, Richard Schultes, who was kind of the first white Western ethnobotanist to go to the Amazon and really engage in a meaningful relationship with Indigenous communities. And that was in the kind of like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that he was doing all of that work. So prior to, as far as I know, he was the first person from the West to go and actually, intentionally learn about these communities and their traditions, rather than just like go into their territories and extract resources and bring disease and, cause destruction. So it was kind of, he was the first one to be exposed to these medicines and these traditions. And, it was part of his work and his investigation to try the medicines. Wade Davis has a really good book called One River, which explores the kind of the life and work of Richard Schultes. And since then, I think, it's kind of like anthropologists, ethnobotanists who went back and did more exploration and tried these medicines. But I would say, what I've heard is it's only really in the last maybe 20 to maximum 30 years that people from the West have actually started to hear about ayahuasca and, go to try the medicine. And maybe in the last 10, 20 years that, people have been taking the medicine outside of the jungle, outside of the countries that it's native to, and spreading it across the world. And now ayahuasca, you'll find it everywhere. It's not legal everywhere, but there are definitely ceremonies happening everywhere underground. So yeah, you might not be hearing about them or seeing, ads for ayahuasca retreats in Europe or Asia or wherever, but it's definitely happening.
Yeah. Something we were talking about when we were kind of talking before the show is taking this outside of the context of like psychedelics and more, I guess, around like shamanism. I was saying to you how I found interesting in a lot of shamanic cultures, people are entering this parallel universe, trance state, another dimension, getting in touch with their spirit, whatever you want to call it. Expanded state of consciousness, maybe is a better way, like you described earlier, not through psychedelics, but actually through music and often like rhythmic drumming. And when I found that out, I've always been into electronic music, like I know you have, because you're from near Manchester, right, Max?
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of people from Manchester into that type of music, like myself. And it kind of got me thinking, obviously we see this like practice of like raving as something that's been around since like, late 80s, early 90s. But I always thought when I read this, I was like, oh, it's kind of like this practice of, dancing all night to just drums. And sometimes it's without taking anything. Sometimes it's with ayahuasca. It's actually like a really ancient thing that's almost this like archetypal situation. And I know when we were talking about it, you thought the same. And obviously you've like interviewed shamans as well.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with, the kind of like the parallels that you're drawing between like electronic music and raving, and then these shamanic cultures that enter into these trance states, which is literally just like at the beat of a drum. It's called shamanic drumming, like core shamanism is a practice which uses that to be able to enter into these other realms and connect with the spirit world and things like that. But I think definitely, another thing that we were talking about was how all of these different elements of rave culture can actually be really healing. And I think a lot of people have kind of, without even really realizing it, healed a lot and done a lot of that like somatic and perhaps trauma healing in these contexts. Because when you think about it, you're in a community, usually with friends. So there's definitely like a level of social connection there and a level like human to human connection there. There's music, which is just healing for so many reasons. But music in itself, especially if you're dancing and moving your body to it, I think there's a really, really healing element to that. And then, like you mentioned, oftentimes taking substances like MDMA, which are very effective at opening the heart and, expressing love and connecting with others. When you kind of put all of those together, it's sort of like somatic expression and dancing, moving the body with music to like a repetitive rhythm or drum, or the community, people that you really connect with. It's not surprising to me that a lot of people have kind of like felt so much healing in that sort of context, and are now starting to draw the parallels between shamanic and ceremonial contexts as well.
Yeah, and we on another podcast we did with a guy called Jeremy O'Connell-Waite, he's a storytelling expert. He was talking about the different elements of a story, and that if you kind of combine all of them, which is essentially more of the emotional side, more of like the logical data side, and then more of your own personal experience and how it relates to you, you get what's kairos. And kairos is actually kind of like a form of time stopping. And that also happens both in ayahuasca, right? And then if you're like at a rave, sometimes you just totally lose track of time and you're like in some different time where time doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had experiences when I was at uni where I would go on nights out and, there would just be moments, whether it's like outside in the smoking area or something with like people that you just met, or with like friends, that you're kind of super close with, you've been at uni with, and there's just these moments of just complete connection, serenity, everything is perfect, super content and happy with life in that moment, and just feeling like really, really present and grateful. I think Yeah, that was definitely a very common experience for me when I was doing that. Not so much anymore, but yeah, definitely my early 20s. There was a lot of that.
The last question I wanted to ask you. So we ask this on the show a lot, but I'm going to try and ask it in a bit of a different way today. Normally the question is, what advice would you give to your younger self? I think probably the most useful way for anyone listening to this to ask this question is, what advice would you give to Mags before she'd taken ayahuasca, around like what should she do in like the build up and after the ceremony?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I would, the advice that I would give to pre-ayahuasca Mags, or, you know, as she's preparing to take it, is just talk to somebody about your preparation, somebody who like really, really knows, you know, whether it's like a professional coach or a practitioner, or like someone in your social circle who really is very, very experienced. And I did do an element of that, but I feel like I could have definitely done more. Maybe in terms of preparation for the first few ceremonies, doing a little bit more somatic work, maybe some breath work to kind of get myself used to entering into those altered states of consciousness. But for me, like the crucial thread through all of this has really just been like community support as well. So maybe even going to a psychedelic integration circle to speak to more people who had experience with it, which is something that I've now found myself doing now as well. I'm facilitating an online integration circle. Back then, I didn't know that these even existed. So yeah, I think that's probably what I'd say.
With these integration circles, are other people that have taken psychedelics and also trying to like integrate their experience, or?
Yeah, usually if it's a psychedelic integration circle, the idea is I mean, the space that I run together with Ivailo, the friend that I had mentioned earlier, we run our integration circle as a space for anybody who is preparing to have a journey. You know, you don't have to have already had experience with psychedelics to come, but maybe you want some guidance, maybe you want some advice, maybe you just want to be in a supportive community, maybe you have already had an experience and you want a safe space to explore that as well. And these are, you know, it's a very, very nourishing space where there's a lot of connection, and it's an opportunity to kind of get vulnerable and go a bit deeper than you might if you were kind of just chatting to people who weren't necessarily on a similar path.
Very cool. Yeah, I didn't do that after my 2 ceremonies, and I kind of wish I had now. Mags, this has been great. I'll put a couple of links that I think, based on that last question, can be useful. Mags has written a great article around like integration, and then also how to choose a ceremony, because that was certainly something I stressed about a lot before. So we'll put those in the show notes. And yeah, thanks a lot for coming on today, Mags.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great.
So yeah, my main takeaways are around integration, I think, because so many people are having spiritual experiences. I think this really goes into the concept of the cosmic bridge, right? Is if we're out there, like up in the clouds, we're having a spiritual experience, we expand our consciousness, we're in a parallel universe, whatever you want to call it. How can we change our lives in a positive way? And it's really cool to think about this term integration, whether it's breath work, meditation, or psychedelics like we're talking about today. How can it have a positive impact on our lives? And what I've done with breathwork, for example, is write down things afterwards, after I've had visions. What are those visions trying to tell me? And like Mags was saying, it's the same with psychedelics, writing down, journaling afterwards, and then also discussing these experiences with a community, other people that have been through a spiritual experience. That's my main takeaway for today. If you think anyone else could benefit from hearing these types of takeaways, please share the podcast with them. Please subscribe to us on YouTube and across your favorite podcast platforms, and we'll see you next week.